In this session, we're going to be looking at the actual legal sections of the book of Exodus. There's a section that basically runs from chapters 20 through 23 that read like what we would consider actual law. And contained within that, at the beginning of chapter 21, are laws regarding slaves. And sometimes the question is raised, wait a second, does God condone slavery? Is he okay with slavery? And as a matter of fact, in America's past, this was one of the passages that was used by slave owners to justify their slavery. And it also strikes us as a little bit ironic that the book of Exodus is largely about God delivering people from slavery, and then the first thing he does is turn around and give them regulations for how to have slaves. And so I want to take a few moments to talk through this seeming disconnect here. There are really two main points that we have to address on these slave laws in Exodus chapter 21. The first issue is we have to understand what is even being talked about here. Some of your translations will actually say servants instead of slaves. And we kind of have to get into the world of what was this type of slavery that is being addressed. Because the bottom line is it's not at all like American history slavery. You see, ancient Israel was an agrarian economy. That means everybody was farm dependent. And as long as the rains were coming and the crops were growing, things were fine. Things would go well. The problem was when there would be famine or the rains wouldn't come and there would be problems. And any time there was a famine, destitution most certainly resulted, especially for poorer people. Now, we know from Scripture that some people in those situations would emigrate. For example, there's a story in Ruth of Elimelech who, during a famine, leaves Bethlehem and goes to Moab in order to find food. Sometimes they would do that. But at other times, what they would do is they would essentially hire themselves out or hire out members of their family to go work for a wealthier landowner, preferably a relative. And the idea was that I'm destitute, there's a famine, and yet I need to provide for my family. So if I can go work for someone else, if I can become their slave or their servant, then that allows me to provide for my family. You see, what is being described in Exodus chapter 21 is much closer to modern day employment, to the modern day idea of I'm going to go get a job, than it is to anything remotely close to American slavery. So that's point number one. Now, point number two is a little harder to grasp, but we have to understand that the legal sections in Scripture, like we have here in Exodus 20 through 23, these legal sections in ancient Israel were actually viewed more as wisdom literature than as law. You see, we live in what's called a statutory law environment. That means we're used to seeing the letter of the law and knowing that we have to apply that law just as it's written, and then we run into all sorts of issues of loopholes and what if this and what if that, and that's kind of how we process legal things to work. But in Old Testament times, it wasn't like that at all. They had what we call common law, and common law was more like how it is with your family. Like, my kids know that they're not supposed to be jumping up and down on the couch, but it's not like I have that posted on the refrigerator. And so when you have a society like ancient Israel that is primarily homogeneous in the sense of these are primarily descendants of Abram, it's a very like-minded group. And so you don't have these big legal codes where you just directly apply them. Rather, you have these examples of laws given that are meant to function as wisdom literature that a judge or a king would meditate on as examples of how to make good legal decisions. Now, I realize I just kind of dropped a little bit of the Dr. E. Smith scholar bomb on you, but let me try and pull it back and get to the point for us. The point is that an ancient Israelite would not necessarily memorize this section and go, okay, I have to apply this law exactly how it's written. Rather, they would look for the intent behind the law. And we have to train ourselves to think of the difference between an application of a principle, which is what we're getting in the laws in this chapter, versus the intent behind the law. And it's really the intent that we have to go for. I'll give you an easy example. In the New Testament, Peter says, a woman's beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as makeup and jewelry and these kinds of things. Now, if we just look at the application of that and immediately apply the application to our own lives, we should be teaching that women in our churches should not wear makeup or jewelry. But fortunately, we realized that what was going on at that time was that young women who needed a good marriage, because that was the only way they were going to be financially provided for, had to kind of gussy themselves up and run this rat race so that they would know they would be provided for. In that culture, at that time, a woman couldn't just go out and get a job. She had to get a good marriage. And so what Peter's doing is he's saying, look, as Christians, we're not going to run that rat race. We're not going to dehumanize our women by making them go through this thing. And we begin to see that the intent here is actually a humanizing, liberating one for women. And we need to apply that intent to our modern circumstances. And that's what I'm trying to drive at here with the legal section in Exodus 20 to 23. It is so easy for us as Christians, especially when we're just trying to find those bits that apply to us and apply to our lives today. It is so easy to completely disregard and ignore the legal sections of the book of Exodus. But here's the thing. If we dig in and we're able to kind of get into that world and the context that they were in, we begin to see that even slave laws, even things like slave laws, are revealing God's grace to us. So at this point, let me kind of wrap things up by telling you a little bit of my own story. When I went off to seminary, I began to take some Old Testament classes, and I found that they were really engaging. And even though I had grown up in the church and I knew the Bible pretty well by the time I went to seminary, I was learning all sorts of new stuff that was really inspiring me in my faith. And I also started to see that I needed to treat the Bible not first and foremost as instructions for how to live my life, but rather I needed to begin to seek out, what is this passage telling me about God? And I just saw that as I dug into the Old Testament, it was fueling my faith. And so along the way, I decided, you know what? I'm going to take a year. And other than my coursework or the stuff we're doing in church, I'm only going to read the Old Testament. Because I wanted to come at the New Testament with the eyes of, say, a disciple of Jesus. And so, honestly, 1 year turned into 3, where I did nothing but pour myself into the Old Testament. And I just saw the way it fueled my faith. And then I had the opportunity to teach a class on the book of Mark. And as I worked through the book of Mark, coming off of 3 years of just being in the Old Testament, my eyes were open to so many new and amazing things. It was crazy wonderful is my point. And what I'm trying to get at is we ignore things like the legal sections of Exodus or the book of Deuteronomy because honestly, they're harder to get into. It's harder to understand that than it is the book of Philippians. But as I poured myself into it, and as I began to ask, what does this show me about God? My testimony is that it fueled my faith. And so as we look at, something like a slave law, which seems really, really irrelevant to us, if I can somehow make it so that you'll begin to say, I want to try and look at Deuteronomy. I'm not going to get it all. There's going to be lots of confusing things. But if you begin to seek out the heart of God, I think that it can do nothing but fuel your faith and inspire you to a deeper walk with the Lord.